Aloha, mai kako. Oh, wow, and that too. We're ready to go. Welcome to Shangri-La. I'm Ben Weitz, the executive director here, and on behalf of our staff, we are thrilled to have this conversation in partnership with Civil Beat. It's an honor to have our guest today here. As a center of Doris Duke Foundation, Shangri-La is here really quite literally as a supporter of Civil Beat. In partnership with the Knight Foundation, we have actually funded an environmental reporter on Beat. So we are really excited in the wake of the Maui fires to have this sort of partnership and to continue the partnership here today. I also like to remind folks, because we're here in Hawaii as the Shangri-La Center of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design, but we are also, as a center of the Doris Duke Foundation, here to remind you of our mission, which is to build a more creative, equitable, and sustainable future. And I couldn't think of a better way of doing so but to really remind ourselves of how do we have accurate and fair journalism here, not just in Hawaii, but on the continent and around the world. So the storytelling that that we get to have at Civil Beat that creates ripples around the globe is so important, not only for here, but for all of our viewers at home as well. So with that, for today's talk, I am delighted that we do have the one and only Dean Baquet with us. With that, round of applause, please. And buckle in, because we've got a bio here. I'm not off book, because you've had quite a storied career here, Dean. Dean served as the executive editor of The Times from 2014 to 22, overseeing the paper in the highest ranked position in the Times newsroom. Before being named executive editor, he was managing editor and previously served as Washington bureau chief for the paper from 2007 to 2011. Dean had rejoined The Times after several years as both editor and managing editor at the Los Angeles Times, where Meredith also spent some time as well. Before originally joining The Times as a Metro reporter in 1990, he reported for the Chicago Tribune, and prior to that, for the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. Hence the Baquet. All right. While at the Chicago Tribune, Dean served as the associate Metro editor for investigations and was chief investigative reporter covering corruption in politics and the garbage hauling industry. And with that, he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting in 1988 when he led a team in documenting corruption in the Chicago City Council, and was a finalist for another Pulitzer Prize in 1994 in the investigative reporting category. Dean is a graduate of Columbia University, and again, we are grateful to have him with us today.
Thank you.
And next, today, Dean is being interviewed by Meredith Artley, who is our current executive in residence at the Doris Duke Foundation and a forever friend to Shangri-La, who, before her move to Hawaii 2 years ago, was the editor-in-chief and senior vice president of CNN Digital Worldwide, who is a board member of Civil Beat, and finally, who also happens to be my good pal. I don't need my notes for that. So with that, Meredith, over to you, and mahalo nui to everyone again for being here.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank
you, Shangri-La team. Thanks, Dean, for being here. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? Good, okay.
Let's just talk about a handful of things. I want to start with Civil Beat, and I want to start with why you're here in Hawaii. And I think we've got an audience here. You gave a great talk. Was it yesterday at Civil Beat, or was it the day before?
Day before.
It was day before yesterday. And a great talk at Civil Beat that was available to the public. And you guys can go online and find it. Right, Ben? Patty, too? So it's just a wonderful talk about kind of why Dean is here in Hawaii from his great work with Civil Beat and his role at the Times. And his work has been with Blaze Lovell, who's standing right back there in the corner. Blaze, wave your hand. And Shaka. Blaze is one of the many outstanding investigative reporters and journalists who care deeply about covering Hawaii and making Hawaii a better and more accountable place under the leadership of Patty and Ben and the whole team. But if you don't mind sharing, as background for everyone who might not have seen the talk, a little bit about what you've been doing with Blaze and why you're here, just give that context.
So 2 years ago, when I stepped aside as editor of the Times, the publisher and I decided to create a program because we were worried about the collapse of local journalism, which is a crisis, a true American crisis. And there's a sub-crisis within it, which is the collapse of local investigative journalism. Because investigative journalism takes time, money, and risk. It's the kind of reporting where you go in and you actually don't know if you're going to land anything. And that's hard for newsrooms that have been shrunk over time to do. So we created this program where journalists all over the country apply to work with the Times for a year. And for a year, they become New York Times reporters. We edit them. We work closely with their news organizations. And they pitch to us an investigative idea. And frankly, Blaze's investigative pitch, I guess it's a year and a half ago, was just terrific. I mean, it really was. It was to look at the role of contracting and people who make campaign contributions and how they dominate contracting in Hawaii. And it was just so terrific, frankly, that when we were dividing up the dozen fellows we would work with, I asked my colleagues if I could work with Blaze. And it was just a terrific project. It really was. We were able to use data journalism to prove the extent of the influence so that it wasn't purely anecdotal. And I thought I was working, frankly, with a young reporter who was going to have a sustained career as an investigative reporter in Hawaii, and I learned a lot from him. And so we have reporters all over the country. We've done a lot of work in Mississippi, Wisconsin, and we try to visit the newsrooms just to spend time with them and meet with the people who care about their coverage. And that's why I'm in Hawaii, though, frankly, it was not a tough sell. I won't say anything about my fellows who are in Mississippi, but this was an easy sell to come here.
It's pretty wonderful here, isn't it?
It sure is.
And your first time here.
And my first time here.
Any favorite parts so far, aside from time at Civil Beat and Shangri-La?
You know, it's funny. I'm a for those of you who are Catholic, I have a tremendous amount of Catholic guilt. So I spend a lot of time working this week just so my colleagues don't think I'm screwing around at the beach. But I've also been screwing around at the beach. And, you know, it's just a beautiful... One of the things I noted to Patty, that if you live... So I grew up in New Orleans. I've lived probably in New York longer than any other place, in Manhattan. And I've also lived in Los Angeles a lot. My entire time here, I've not heard anyone blow their horn once. I find that absolutely amazing. I was in an Uber, and we were behind another car that had just stopped in traffic, and I kept waiting for the driver to blow his horn, and he did, and I thought, this is sort of cool. So I like the fact that it's a relaxing, lovely, diverse place. So
How do the Honolulu people feel about... There is horn honking, right, on occasion? We heard one in Waimea the other day, and that really shook the whole town for days.
But you have to remember, my apartment in New York is in Greenwich Village, and the honking of cars on the corner of 10th and University in Greenwich Village is like a constant part of the music of my life.
So one of the things that Shangri-La believes that it is, and I think everyone who comes here kind of feels it and sees it, has been hinted at, it's a place of transformation. It's a place of great complexity, like Hawaii. There's a lot of, what is this doing here? It's beautiful. Should this be here? How did it get here? The kind of combination of art and architecture and nature, kind of all, it's just a sensory overload for a lot of people. And there's a lot to think about in terms of Doris Duke and her story and privilege and art and beauty and who has what in Hawaii. So there's just a lot of layers here to unpack. And it's one of the reasons that so many people love Shangri-La, not just because of its overt beauty. And so it's a place where we like to have conversations that get into transformation and thinking about change and thinking about the layers and complexity of life. So if you don't mind, if we can get a little existential for a moment.
Not at all.
I'd love to talk to you about, you've had many, at least for those of us who have been colleagues and following your career, we've seen the kind of changes and transformations you've gone through publicly, from leaving as the executive editor to the Times to this incredible role you're in now. We've seen you leave the New York Times for the LA Times and then go back to the New York Times to run it. And I'm sure there's been many transformations and changes in your life that are lesser known. So I would just love for you to talk about how you see change, if you don't mind.
No, not at all. You know, it's interesting. So 2 minutes of background about me. Actually, I always get anxious when people say I graduated from Columbia University. I actually dropped out. I started work as a journalist at 19. I left college. I went back home to New Orleans and started working for the afternoon paper. And I've been working, and then I was the editor. Eventually became the editor of the LA Times and the editor of the New York Times. And those are really intensive jobs. You can't overstate how intense they are. I mean, you live with your phone literally next to your bedside. You never turn your phone off. Just never. And the transformation for me over the last 2 years, which is I read more. I've always been a big reader. I've thought a lot about journalism, the good and bad of journalism. I've thought a lot about, you have to think, if you've worked as intensively as I have, you think about the things you gave up, because you don't become, you don't start where I started. I grew up in the back of a restaurant in New Orleans. My parents ran a neighborhood restaurant. You don't start where I started and become the executive editor of the New York Times without giving stuff up along the way. And I actually think I've thought a lot more about that. I try to spend more time with my son, because he says that he doesn't remember the time I didn't spend with him. I think he's being nice. So I actually think I'm in the middle of I'm giving back to journalism. This program is not, there's nothing in this program for the New York Times. It's a completely altruistic program. It's the Times is funding it. And I think a lot about what journalism has done for me. And I think a lot about what things in journalism are good, which I think is mostly good. I've thought a lot about what things I would do differently as a journalist. And I don't think I've ever had, so I stepped aside almost 2 years ago. I don't think I've had that much time to just reflect on a life and a career. Somebody asked me, more than one person have asked me if I wanted to write a memoir, and I said, absolutely not. I do not want to do that. But I've thought a lot about transformation and change. And it just so happens that my profession is changing dramatically. There's a whole new generation coming into the profession of journalism who ask hard questions. I grew up in a world where you didn't ask hard questions. If the editor said, jump, you jumped. And that's not true in the next generation, with the next generation of journalists. Frankly, I like this, even though it makes me uncomfortable. I like people to jump a little bit. It makes me uncomfortable. It's been good for me to think about it. So I actually think I'm in the middle of, you told me that you might ask this, I actually think I'm in the middle of a pretty substantial internal and external transformation.
Why won't you write a memoir?
There are two kinds of memoirs people ask me to write. One is Marty Barron, who was the editor of the Post, is one of my best friends, and he wrote a memoir about covering Trump. Oh my God, I do not want to write a memoir about covering Trump. I'd like to put some of those years behind me, and I'm not that interested in writing a memoir of my life. It would just take so much reporting. If you want to read a fantastic semi-memoir, and this is the only kind I would ever do, and I don't have the courage to do it, Joseph Lelyveld, who hired me at the Times, who Meredith knows too, who died just a few months ago, was one of the great American journalists. And Joe did something. He didn't write a memoir. He wrote what he called a memory loop. And he went back and re-reported his life. And there's some amazing scenes in it. There's one scene he had his father was a very prominent rabbi who gave the eulogy for Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, who were killed in Mississippi. But Joe had a very troubled relationship with his father. And there's a scene in the memoir where he calls his brother from one of the houses they grew up in when his father was rising as a rabbi. And Joe says to his brother, "You're not going to believe this. The house we grew up in is really way smaller than I remembered." And he said, "And guess what? It's now a home for troubled children." And his brother says, "It was a home for troubled children when we lived there too." So I think that's a little too much courage, and I wouldn't be as courageous. So
You seem pretty courageous, Dean. You've done a lot of great things for journalism, for the industry, for the spread of truth and knowledge. So thank you for that. You went through, and I was at CNN at the same time. You went through I don't know how you think about the eras of news and cycles you've gone through, but you went through a period where there was a global pandemic, a racial reckoning in the summer of 2020, an election, an insurrection, and all at the same time, kind of a new culture that was emerging in newsrooms, and not just newsrooms, and other organizations as well. So how'd that go for you? I mean, how do you think about those news cycles and those moments where things were so intense, knowing the job was as intense as it was, and even in the slow news days, you had that phone near you. How did you deal with all of that change all at once?
You know, I have a lot of thoughts. It was really difficult, really difficult. I mean, Trump was a difficult president to cover. The pandemic was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, just extraordinarily difficult to know the balance between providing information that people needed to cope with their lives, the science, which was new to everybody. I mean, even all the scientists didn't quite know what to do. It was extraordinarily difficult. I will say, I don't think as a journalist I've ever felt more needed or necessary. I felt like readers really wanted to understand how to deal with the pandemic. They really wanted to understand how to deal with the political and social changes in America. So at the height of the pandemic, it just so happened my family was in California, and my son was graduating from grad school in Los Angeles, and I was there for that. And then I flew back to New York. And not long after I flew back, it became clear all businesses were shut down. So the newsroom was shut down. So I was running the New York Times from the dining table in my apartment in New York, in Greenwich Village. And it just so happened that all of the demonstrations started at Union Square, which was like 5 blocks from where I worked. And every evening, being editor of a major news organization, I don't know if Patty has the same experience, there's a certain distance from the news, whether you like it or not, because you're sitting in a newsroom, you're sort of closeted and surrounded. So every night at the end of the news cycle, we'd put the paper to bed. I'm sitting at my dining table with a laptop. I would throw on a jacket, and I would just walk out into Union Square, and I would watch the demonstrations. And I thought, I'm living in the middle of history. So on the one hand, it was really difficult and challenging. The staff was restive, which is hard to manage. On the other hand, the whole country was restive. Why should my staff be any different? But I also felt like we were necessary. We were needed. I've never had so many people stop me on the street and thank me for coverage. So it was hard, but it was also a reminder of why we're in the business. So, for the most part, hard, but my God, was it a rewarding. There was one moment which is going to tell you more about New York than it is about anything else. As you can imagine, New York City was not pro-Trump, especially Greenwich Village was not pro-Trump. So the morning, and it was a morning, CNN call, I guess when Fox called the election, I'm going to get my days wrong, but like a Friday night, we were more cautious because we have our whole system. So I'm sitting at my dining table with a Zoom call with all of the people involved in calling the election, the polling operation, the managing editor, and everybody else. And we're finally making a decision. We're going to call, I guess Wisconsin was the last state that put it over. And I've never had this experience. Sitting at the table, all of a sudden, so I say, okay, let's call it. The alert goes out within a minute. Another minute, I could hear cheers on the streets right outside my door, and I thought, that does not happen all the time. So hard, but historic.
You're making me think of what happened at the CNN newsroom in 2016 on election night, when we started to realize that the way that everybody thought it was going to go is not the way it was going to go. And there was a moment, and you did the same thing at the Times, I'm sure, on the site, I'm sure in the paper, but there was a moment where, you had prepared for, potentially the announcement of the first Madam President and what that was going to look like on a homepage and what that was going, and you prepared for what it would look like if Trump was going to win. And at CNN, we did a lot of rehearsals, right? And you got to do the broadcast network and think about, all the different scenarios and the ways that Wolf Blitzer and Jake Tapper may call it on air, right? And we hadn't done a lot of the scenarios where Trump had won. And there was a moment that night when, and everybody was watching The Needle, right, Dean? Everyone was watching The Needle on the
I remember.
Times homepage. And then also looking at all the other data and information that was coming in. And I just remember that moment where I asked the person who had their hands on the homepage, I said, we need to get ready for the homepage that has Trump winning the election. We need to be prepared for that template, because I don't know that we have that. We haven't practiced that a whole lot. And you're in the middle of the newsroom, and I'm asking for them to prepare that, and everyone kind of stops and looks around and says, "Really?" And it's like, "Yeah, really." So I'm kind of, it brings us, there's many places you can jump off of that, but I'm curious about your thoughts on, since a Trump presidency and potentially a second one, but since the first one put kind of journalists in this situation where you're weighing for the first time publicly, do you call something a lie? Do you call someone a liar? Right? So I'm thinking about how you addressed advocacy journalism, and can you just say that this guy's not doing the right thing and according to the tenets of journalism, or can you not say that? Because guess what? The majority of the population. Now we won't get into the Electoral College. Sorry, I was about to go down there. But he was elected, and so how did you address that in the newsroom? And if you can, how do you think about what's happening right now? And is there going to be a Biden presidency, a Harris presidency, a Trump presidency? Or
now you're getting hard.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, first off, we were just as surprised as you all were. In fact, the tradition is they bring to the executive editor 2 front pages. And frankly, most elections of the last generation have been close enough to, and nobody brought me a Trump front page. And I said, you got to give me a Trump front page, if for no other reason other than tradition. He was as surprised, by the way, we had people in his headquarters, and he wasn't expecting to win. We were the first ones to use the word lie in reference to Trump. And the reason was the moment was when he finally said that Barack Obama was born in the United States. Because if you look back at what he had said before that, he actually, not only did he raise questions about where he was born, he actually said he had private investigators looking into it, and they had found interesting stuff. Well, that was clearly a lie. So that was the first time we used the word lie. And we've used it since. I think you got to use it sparingly. The rule was, when I was the editor, I wanted to know when we used it. Because, look, I don't want, if the governor of Maine says her budget is $220 million, and it turns out that it's $240 million. Now, I don't want to use I don't want lie to proliferate so much in the pages of the New York Times that it just loses its power and its force, right? Because, I mean, is that really a lie, or who knows? So that we were the first ones to use it. You know, I looked to history, and it turns out that in moments of extraordinary crisis and coverage, American newspapers have, in fact, while holding on to, whether you want to call it objectivity or just fairness, have actually go back and look at David Halberstam's coverage of Vietnam. It was like somebody took a page from a whole nother newspaper and glued it onto the front page of the New York Times. He was essentially saying very forcefully that America was losing and there was no way it could be turned around. Go back and look at the best coverage of the civil rights movement. And even people like Joe Lelyveld, who was my friend and mentor, wrote very forcefully about what the South was like during that period. So I do think that there is, within the realm of striving for fairness and independence, and I care more about independence than objectivity, within that realm, there is still room to write tough coverage and to call a lie a lie. And I think the best news organizations have done that. Have we fumbled sometimes? Of course. I said this a couple of days ago, I'll say it again. News organizations are by their nature flawed. They have to be. We produce thousands of stories a week about a whole range of subjects, from movie reviews to dicey political stories to local coverage to Wordle. There is no way that everything we do can be flawless, and we need to own up to that. But I actually think that there was a way. I mean, when I was the editor, we got hold of Trump's taxes, and wrote very forcefully about it. Even before we did that, we were the first ones to write stories about his abuse of women, and we were the first ones to write stories that said that Donald Trump did not make his money himself, that his father had given him so much money that even if, I can't remember the exact line, but even if he had done nothing but invest it safely, he would have as much money as he did now. So I think that even within the realm of independence, and the reason, frankly, that I defend the New York Times and other news organizations writing about Joe Biden and the issues of his age, that is a legitimate news story. And you can't say that because we don't want Donald Trump to win, and I'm not saying that's the Times' view, but that's the way a lot of Americans feel. Please don't write about Joe Biden's age. Joe Biden's age, Donald Trump's age, are legitimate news stories. And independence means that you ask hard questions of everybody. And I think that holding on to that, frankly, and holding on to that history, and I had sitting in my office when I was the editor a book called Covering Vietnam, which I would look back at Homer Biggert and David Halberstam and all the coverage of Vietnam, and covering civil rights, and I would look back at Lelyveld and all the others. And there was room in independence to also just sort of call people out.
Thank you for that. Do you think, one more on kind of the summer of 2020 and the racial reckoning in particular, as you were the first black editor of the New York Times.
And actually of the LA Times, too.
And of the LA Times, right. I mean, what's next, you know? And I was thinking of that summer and that moment and all the coverage and the conversations where the news became, you know, you talked about it with the election, but the news became personal in newsrooms. Yeah. And so I'm curious about how you experience that with the staff, and I'm curious about what you observe now from a little bit on the outside on what appears to be, maybe you agree or not, a backlash against diversity and equity and inclusion. And do you think that's happening or not? And how did you kind of deal with that at the time and think about what what diversity means for the sake of a fair and fulsome news report?
I don't think a journalism organization can cover a community fairly and accurately if it's not diverse. I mean, the newsrooms I started in had very few women, and the women who were in the newsrooms covered quote unquote women news. And I don't think how could those newsrooms have actually covered their cities with any kind of like thought or balance if half the people who lived in those cities were not reflected in their coverage and the interest? I mean, American newsrooms didn't start writing about the whole range of issues that affected women and later minorities until they started looking like those newsrooms. So I think diversity is not, we can have a debate about the justice of it, but a newsroom is supposed to reflect, not precisely, but a newsroom is supposed to be connected enough to its community to cover it with some accuracy. One of the other things I tried to do, by the way, was to make sure that the newsroom had veterans in it. Because how can you cover, like, we were covering 2 wars. How can you cover those 2 wars without people who had experienced those wars, without people who had experienced the loss of seeing friends who died in war? So I think you can't, it's got to look like, so, you know, there were a lot of uncomfortable conversations in the newsroom because the people who came in who looked different than the traditional journalists in newsrooms wanted to push us in certain directions. And frankly, my view of that is that's fine within limits. There are limits. If you sign up to work for the New York Times, you have to accept certain things. You cannot publicly spout off your political positions. You just can't. It endangers the independence of the newsroom. If the 2,000 people who work in the New York Times newsroom are all tweeting all day about whatever they care about, you can't do that. But if you want to challenge me, and if you want to say, Dean, I think you're wrong on this one, in the end I get to decide. Otherwise, we'd never put out a daily news report. But I believe you got to listen. You know, I once had a young reporter who I had recruited from another news organization. And I knew in recruiting her that centrally she believed the things I believed. But there was something she wanted to push me on. So I sat down at lunch with her, and I'll never forget this conversation. We were arguing. I never argued with Jill Lelyveld, but I wanted people to argue with me. So I'm arguing with her. And at the end of the conversation, in which I finally said, look, we're going to have, I hate to say it, but we're going to have to do it my way. She looked at me and she said, what did you think was going to happen when you hired people like me? Did you think we were just going to be just like you, but younger? And I remember thinking, I kind of hope that, but I guess not.
All right, I want to follow up on my earlier question, and then we'll open up for any conversations or comments or questions folks have for Dean. Just noting you didn't answer my question on who's going to win the election. So
I'm not that's the only thing I'll punt.
Are you going to make a prediction? I mean,
Not I'll so
I know he wouldn't, but
here's my record of predictions. When I was managing editor of the LA Times, I went to Barack Obama. Barack Obama gave a very famous speech at one of the big these annual press associations in Washington that I always hated and eventually took us out of. And David Axelrod, who was an Obama aide, but also is a longtime Chicago reporter, so I knew him from Chicago. And I went up for drinks with him afterward. And he said, Dean, Barack Obama could be president of the United States. And I said to him, you are out of your mind. So I make no predictions. Always wrong.
all right. Questions or anything to share with Dean? Ashley.
Hi, Dean. First of all, I just watched She Said twice on the plane to and from Europe, and I'm wondering if you agreed with your casting.
I did. I think I'm funnier than he was.
Okay.
But no, I mean, frankly, with some tiny licenses and condensing, it was a pretty accurate portrait of the whole Harvey Weinstein episode.
So in Hawaii, I would argue that Civil Beat is the only place where we have really brave storytelling, holding leadership accountable on a regular basis. Like many cities the size of Honolulu, we live in a media desert. We don't have the kinds of relationships that make hard reporting easy, because you're not reporting about someone over there. You're reporting about someone you went to high school with or somebody who you're related to. So I'm wondering if in your work with Blaze, as you did this really, really important storytelling about the dynamics that are holding our state back, actually, from moving forward on really critical issues related to fairness and families and climate change, if you confronted that part of our place that makes really brave reporting so hard, and if the personal relationships that hold together and hold back our political system made it difficult, and Blaze, I'd love for you to jump in, made it difficult to tell those stories because you knew the lives that were going to be impacted when the truth was finally told.
I'll say one thing, but I really do think Blaze should answer some of that. I do think that I think the problem of local news is a huge crisis that I'm not sure Americans quite understand how bad it is. As part of, I mean, I think of the program I run as like a drop in the bucket. In fact, we're trying to figure out ways to expand it. I mean, we do 12 projects a year, like the one we did with Blaze, and each one feels great, but they all feel like I say no more than I say yes to people who propose projects. I thought two things. First, I do think there was tremendous difficulty in Blaze's story. Part of it was I don't think that the state had that kind of deep prove it reporting before. That's not a comment on Civil Beats, which I think does a tremendous job. I agree. But a year's worth of reporting is very different. I do think there were instances where, and he should talk about it. I do think that there were instances that were really hard, where people didn't want to share information with us, where people thought things that we thought were outrageous were just like the way we do business. It felt a little bit like Louisiana. But you should talk some, Blaze. You should answer.
Yeah, I mean, to your original question, I think what made it easier for me is that I am sort of reporting on someone else over there, because I don't come from the world, of politics and influential people that I cover. My dad paves roads for the city. My mom's in patient accounts at Hawaii Pacific Health. She owned the bar before that shut down. So I didn't grow up in this, universe that I'm covering. So it's weird in the sense that I grew up in Hawaii. I'm from here. But I'm still sort of covering this whole world of politics as an outsider, because it's not something that, my family was involved in or I was involved in. Someone like me is never going to sniff those kinds of levels here. And, I mean, that's really why I got into journalism, is because of that,
We're all glad you did.
Boy, I am too.
We got one right here. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Julian. I'm an associate professor of journalism at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And I guess I just wanted to throw out a couple of simple questions. I really should know better your positions about this, but I don't. So that's kind of why I'm asking. And they just have to do with objectivity. And that's something I've published about, but more importantly, maybe for this conversation, is that my students overwhelmingly, from the beginning of when they come in to when they end, think that journalism, that objectivity is the alpha and omega of journalism, and that means, and of course they don't have the life experience or the journalism experience to know any more than what they've heard, but that means being neutral, being unbiased, being impartial. And it's always my job to sort of say the world's more complicated than that, and the job is more complicated than that. And my question is that you come at it from a different perspective because you're doing the job every day, and you and everybody at the Times has to get through the day and not philosophize endlessly about it, which is our job, I guess. But there was a decisive shift that happened with the New York Times when Trump came in, and it was noticeable. You guys had to adjust to the reality of the way politics had shifted so dramatically. And at the same time, you weren't called on to explain all of that. And so there's a lot that's unsaid about objectivity that I'm really curious to hear you kind of fill in, because I think, like me, you're probably a little uncomfortable. Like I heard you say earlier, you're a little uncomfortable. And then my follow-up, just quickly to get it in, is it's to me, it's been remarkable what's happened with the Siena poll coverage. You got on the one hand, the opinion page of the New York Times, and on the other hand, the news section of the New York Times, and the way they've come at Biden, and whether you would call that crusading journalism that they've been doing since the fall, or whether that's people need to understand that as objectivity, or how you would describe it.
Boy, that's a great question, and it's a good chance to sort of pull back. And so, a little bit about the history. Does everybody know what the whole debate about objectivity, or should I reprise it? Okay. So, first off, theoretically, objectivity is the view that every reporter should go into a story and park his or her beliefs to the side and just report independently. I actually believe in that. But nobody's objective. If you read the history of objectivity was never a statement, and there actually are histories of objectivity, believe it or not. Objectivity was the notion of it was created in the early part of the 20th century by Walter Lippmann and others. And the view was, this was a period, the height of yellow journalism, when every news organization took a strong political position, and you could tell it in their pages. They called the mayor a jerk if they had disagreed with him, and it was the Wild West. And the view was, no one person can be objective, but let's create a system of editing and a system of ethics where we can do our best to be objective, and where, frankly, if I wear my political views on my sleeve, which I shouldn't, I was the editor of the New York Times, it's somebody's job to steer the place straight, if you will. I do believe that reporters and editors and the news organization as a whole should be fair and nonpartisan. And I do believe that in the news pages, and I'll explain something different about, in the news pages, most issues are actually really complicated and have multiple sides. We get very caught up in like a handful of issues like Trump or whatever. But truth be told, most issues that we grapple with as people are really religion is very complicated. I grew up in a very Catholic family. I haven't been to church in many, many years, and I don't consider myself religious, but I have deep respect for people who are. I came back from Colombia and sat down at the coffee table with my father, who, my late father, was very religious, and I told him I was a smart ass of 18, that I was pro-choice. I thought he was going to deck me. Does that mean that I think my father was a terrible person? No, it means that these issues are really complicated. And part of our job, and this is why I believe in independence, is to go out and really grapple and I'm not talking about there's some issues that are easy. Anti-Semitism, easy. Racism, easy. Misogynism, easy. Those are like bad. A lot of other things that Americans grapple with are really complicated. Yes, there is climate change, and journalists were too late to acknowledge it. How to deal with it, how to fix it, that is really complicated. It's really complicated. It touches on the economy, it touches on people's lives. So my view is that the best journalists really work hard to understand on the most complicated issues how people think about them. The editorial page is different. When I ran the Times, I ran everything but the opinion pages. The opinion pages are supposed to have strong opinions, state their views. You know, when I'm sure that my successor, Joe Kahn, had no idea that the editorial board was going to call for Biden to step down. And I'm also sure he had no idea that the editorial board was going to say that Trump was unfit for office. So there's a wall between the two of us. But I actually think we should strive for some kind of independence and open-mindedness. I've stopped using the word objectivity because it's become such a third rail. Here's what I believe. I believe you should go into a story open-minded. I'll tell you one, I know I'm yapping a lot, but there was a fantastic story that a reporter named Eli Zaslow did about homelessness in California. Just mind-blowingly empathetic, and I believe in empathy. And it was about a man who had a small neighborhood restaurant in a part of California that was suddenly really beset by a crisis of homelessness. On the one hand, Eli helped you understand the lives of the people who were homeless and their terrible lives and their terrible plight. He also helped you understand the guy who with his wife had a small restaurant that was struggling to stay in business because of the homelessness around him. Who's right in that story, right? That to me is empathetic, independent journalism. So that's what I believe.
We are running short on time.
It's because my answers are so long, forgive me.
I know, but they're good. So thank you. They're really fascinating. It's such an honor, privilege to have this conversation with you and have you here. So thank you, Dean. Before we close up and make sure everybody can get some drinks and other poo-poos before hopping on the shuttles, I want to hand over to another Ben Nishimoto of Civil Beat, who'll make a couple of remarks, and then Ben Weitz will close us up, and everyone should have some drinks and ask Dean any questions in the remaining time you have at Shangri-La.
Thank you so much. Round of applause for Meredith and Dean. Meredith, thanks for moderating. Dean, thanks for making the trip out here. It's harder to imagine a more important conversation amid such a beautiful venue. Like what the staff doesn't tell you here is that they control like when the waves break and when the sun sets. This is just like all a big green screen behind us. But we're really fortunate to Shangri-La and the foundation, the Doris Duke Foundation, for not only being thought partners on this event and for hosting, but for also, with regards to the foundation, supporting our Maui fire efforts, particularly over this past year. And the important reporting that our staff has done to sort of inform not just the residents of Lahaina and Kula, but the state as well. So very thank you for that. Lastly, I just wanted to thank you all. I think Civil Beat's existence, much less our ability to grow, is not guaranteed. And everyone on staff understands that. We know that. We understand that that's a supreme responsibility. And that our ability to do good work is completely dependent on the level of community support, right? All of you here have been either financial supporters of Civil Beat over the years or have directed supporters our way. And what's truly remarkable is that for all of you here, you support different aspects of our work, and then you all take a step back and let the reporters and the editors and the admin and the support staff do what we feel is necessary. And we totally understand every day that that's an extraordinary amount of trust that you place in us. So on behalf of the staff of Civil Beat, again, reporters, editors, photographers, admin, operations, audience building, fundraising, we just wanted to thank you all. It's great to see you all here in one place. And feel free, as Meredith says, to take the remaining time to check out this beautiful venue. But thanks again so much for being here. We appreciate it.